What's up guys, Neil Weaver here, bringing you the first series of the Energy Academy by Modo. Let's start at the beginning. In this course, I'll be outlining the basic structure of Great Britain's electricity system. By the end of this series, you'll understand what we mean by generation and demand and how they're measured, how electricity travels from generation sites to your home, the physical infrastructure that makes that happen, the main players involved in ensuring that the lights stay on, and how all of those things fit together. But first, why am I talking about Great Britain and not the United Kingdom? The electricity market for Great Britain covers England, Scotland and Wales, but not Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is instead part of an electricity market with the Republic of Ireland, which is operated and managed separately to Great Britain's electricity market. While there are many similarities, there are also lots of differences between the two, and that's why I'm just going to be focusing on Great Britain in this series. So, let's dive into our electricity system. In the next episode, I'll be providing high-level definitions of each stage of the electricity journey, from generators to your homes. I'll see you there. Welcome back to the Energy Academy. I'm Neil Weaver, and in this episode, I'll be introducing you to the four main stages of any electricity system. In order to turn your lights on, you need electricity. That electricity must travel from a generation site, a power station or wind farm or the like, across transmission lines and into your home. Simple. Except that it isn't. The biggest challenge is making sure that the amount of electricity generated matches demand. In Great Britain, there are countless sources of electricity generation located in every part of the country. Making sure that the electricity they produce gets to where it needs to be at the right times is a massively complicated process. Matching supply with demand so that there's never too much or too little electricity on the system at any given time is a delicate balancing act. So, what are the four main stages of any electricity system? The first is generation, where electricity is produced. In the past, this generally happened by burning stuff to power turbines. However, in today's world, there's a much more diverse mix of generation, including intermittent renewable sources like wind and solar. The next stage is transmission, where electricity is transported across the country from generation sites to where the demand for that electricity is coming from. This generally happens via large overhead or underground wires and cables known as transmission lines. Next up is distribution, where that electricity is then delivered at a more local level to the homes and businesses that need it. The last step is consumption. That electricity that was produced in the generation stage and transported in the transmission stage and delivered in the distribution stage can now be consumed or used. Essentially, you can now switch and keep your lights on. But what does all this mean? Well, in essence, it means supply must match demand. There's just no way of storing the amount of electricity that Great Britain needs, so it has to be generated, transmitted, distributed, and consumed continuously in real time. Participants in the system, barring consumers, need to obtain the correct licenses from Ofgem, the Office for Gas and Electricity Markets, who are Great Britain's independent energy regulator. But what goes on at each stage of the process, and who are the other major players? Let's start at the beginning. In the next episode, I'll outline what I mean by generation. I'll see you there. Yo, what's up? It's Neil again, and welcome back to the Energy Academy. As mentioned in the previous episode, the first stage of any electricity system is generation. Most electricity is generated at large power stations, but generators come in all different shapes and sizes. The most recognisable are traditional power stations, where fuel is burnt to spin turbines, nuclear power stations, and renewables like wind and solar. Basically, generators produce electricity. The term generation usually refers to the amount of electricity produced, but how is generation measured? Well, generation's actually measured in two ways. The first is in watts, which measure power, i.e. the rate at which electricity is transferred at a single point in time. 1,000 watts make a kilowatt, and 1,000 kilowatts a megawatt, and 1,000 megawatts a gigawatt, and so on to terawatt, etc. In the context of generation, you're likely to hear megawatts come up when people discuss the rated power or capacity of a generator. So, if you hear someone say, "We've just built a 50 megawatt wind farm," the maximum output of those turbines at any one time is 50 megawatts. For an idea of scale, an average single modern wind turbine has a capacity of about 2.5 to 3.5 megawatts, and the average domestic rooftop solar panel system has a capacity of about 4 kilowatts, so roughly 1,000 times smaller. Great Britain's largest power station, which is owned by Drax and located in North Yorkshire, that burns wood pellets, and it has a capacity of 3.9 gigawatts. This means that it's over 1,000 times more powerful than an average single wind turbine and around 1,000,000 times more powerful than an average domestic rooftop solar panel system. So that's how we measure power, but what's the second way of measuring generation? Watt hours are the units used to measure energy, and they go up in the same orders of magnitude as watts. So watt hours, kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, gigawatt hours. 1 megawatt hour just means that 1 megawatt of power is being sustained for an hour. So, if that 50 megawatt wind farm I was talking about generates at full capacity for an hour, it will generate 50 megawatt hours of electricity. And if it generates at its peak for 2 hours, it will generate 100 megawatt hours of electricity. So, that's how generation's measured. But who decides what type of generators get built and where? In Great Britain, for the most part, generators are privately developed and owned, and that decision is usually based on the potential for profit and/or government policy. At a high level, energy suppliers, the companies that you pay money to ensure that your lights come on, have to forecast how much electricity they'll need and when they'll need it to meet their customers' demands, including yours. Suppliers then enter into contracts with generators to purchase the electricity they'll need. Generators then produce the electricity at the requisite time to meet the demand. The owners are then paid for the electricity they provide. But what do I mean by demand? Well, in the next episode, I'll explain exactly that. I'll see you there. So now we know what generation is, how it's measured, where it comes from, and who provides it, we need to understand why it's needed. As I've already mentioned repeatedly, the supply of electricity must meet demand. But what on earth do I mean by demand? Demand simply refers to the amount of electricity being used at any given time. Therefore, the more electricity being used, the higher the demand. When people talk about demand, they're usually referring to the amount of energy being used at a single point in time, which is measured in watts. You may have heard peak demand figures quoted before. This is the moment at which the country is using the most electricity in a given time frame, and in Great Britain, it's most often quoted in gigawatts. For example, in 2021, peak demand in Great Britain was just over 43 gigawatts. Consumption, on the other hand, refers to the total amount of electricity used in a given time frame. It's measured in some magnitude of watt hours. For example, electricity consumption across the whole of 2021 was 260 terawatt hours, or 260 million megawatt hours. So, where does demand come from? Well, anything or anyone that uses electricity. As I mentioned in the previous episode, energy suppliers have to purchase enough electricity to meet their customers' demands based on demand forecasts. But who's responsible for ensuring that supply and demand are balanced at all times? In Great Britain, the organisation that manages this is National Grid Electricity System Operator, or National Grid ESO for short. National Grid ESO ensures that there is never too much or too little electricity on the system at any given time, in order to keep the lights on. Basically, if there's too much electricity passing through the system, things go bang and break, and if there's not enough electricity passing through the system, your lights won't come on at all. National Grid ESO also carries out a number of other roles, such as managing frequency and voltage, but we'll come back to those in a future series. So, energy suppliers predict how much demand there'll be from customers, and then purchase that electricity from generators. It's worth remembering here that the amount of electricity needed in Great Britain can't be stored, so it has to be generated, transmitted, distributed, and consumed continuously in real time. So, generators and suppliers inform National Grid ESO of how much generation and demand there'll be, at what times and where. Because these forecasts will never be entirely accurate, National Grid ESO has to balance supply and demand in real time. They do this by finding extra generation to cover any shortfall, or by decreasing generation to alleviate any oversupply. So, now you know what's meant by generation and demand. In the next episode, I'll explain how electricity travels from where it's produced to where it's needed. I'll see you there. Yo guys, it's Neil again, with another episode of the Energy Academy. Now we know what generation and demand mean, you need to understand how electricity travels from generation sites to the places where the demand is coming from. The electricity produced by generators travels through wires and cables to where it needs to be. There are two types of networks that help electricity travel from one place to another, and they're essentially differentiated by size in more than one sense. Those two networks are defined by the geographical size of the networks themselves, by the voltage of the cables, and by the size of the generators they're connected to. The major nationwide ones are called transmission networks. A transmission network is made up of long-distance, high-voltage cables that can transmit very large amounts of electricity. Therefore, it might be helpful to think of transmission networks as the motorways of the electricity system. Electricity produced makes its way from generation sites, power stations and wind turbines to the transmission network. But what is voltage? Voltage is the pressure that pushes electricity from one place to another. The wires in your domestic appliances, like kettles for example, are around 200 volts, which just means they're designed to withstand pressure of 200 volts. At a national scale, when we talk about the transmission of electricity, those wires and cables are hundreds of kilovolts, so thousands of times bigger. The wires and cables in the transmission network have physical limits on how much power can be pushed along them. Those limits therefore need to be taken into account when deciding how much electricity travels across which wires across however many miles to its destination. But who looks after the physical infrastructure of the transmission network? Those wires and cables. In England and Wales, they're owned and looked after and maintained and improved upon by National Grid Electricity Transmission, or National Grid ET for short. National Grid ESO, the system operator I introduced earlier, who are responsible for balancing supply and demand, and National Grid ET, who look after the physical infrastructure of the transmission system, are two separate entities, albeit both operating under the National Grid umbrella. In Scotland, it's slightly different. The system operator is still National Grid ESO. However, the transmission networks are looked after by Scottish Power Transmission or Scottish and Southern Energy Networks Transmission, depending on which part of Scotland you're in. In the next episode, I'll look at the smaller networks, the ones that take electricity from the transmission networks to your homes and businesses. I'll see you there. Hi again, Neil with another instalment of the Energy Academy. So, once electricity has been transported via the transmission lines, or the motorways of the electricity system, how does it reach homes and businesses? Well, via A roads and B roads, naturally. These secondary local networks are called the distribution networks. They run at lower voltages than the transmission networks and take electricity from transmission lines to your homes and businesses. These distribution networks are split by geographic region, known as grid supply point groups. There are 14 grid supply point groups in Great Britain, and each is looked after by a distribution network operator, or DNO. DNOs are just privately owned businesses that manage the distribution network for one or more regions. Like National Grid ET, albeit at a local level, the primary responsibility of DNOs is to look after the physical infrastructure of the distribution networks, wires and cables. They must ensure that electricity is able to be transported to where it needs to be, according to instructions from National Grid ESO. Anyway, to get from a motorway to an A or B road, you need to transfer at a junction. In the electricity system, those junctions are called grid supply points. At grid supply points, we have substations, which reduce the voltage of electricity so that it can be easily and safely distributed to your homes. It's an intermediate stage to get goods from the manufacturer to the end consumer, and the distribution networks of the electricity system are no different. And that's it. Now you know what goes on at each stage of the electricity system in Great Britain. In the next episode, we'll run through a quick recap. I'll see you there. Oi, it's Neil, and welcome back to the final episode of the first series of the Energy Academy. As a quick reminder, here's a brief run through of the topics I covered in this introductory course. Firstly, there are 4 stages of any electricity system: generation, transmission, distribution and consumption. Because there's no way of storing the amount of electricity that Great Britain needs, it has to be generated, transmitted, distributed and consumed continuously in real time. Because of this, balancing supply and demand is extremely complicated. Electricity is generated at power stations, and in Great Britain, generators make money by generating electricity and selling it. Generation of electricity is measured in magnitudes of watts, i.e. the amount of electricity transferred at a single point in time, or in watt hours, the amount of electricity transferred across a given time frame. Suppliers, the companies that you pay money to ensure your lights come on, buy electricity from generators to meet their customers' demand. Demand simply refers to the amount of electricity being used at a given point in time. Whenever you use electricity, you are creating demand, and that demand has to be met by generation. But who ensures that generation and demand are balanced? Well, that's National Grid ESO, who makes sure that your lights stay on. A large part of their role is balancing generation and demand in real time, because forecasts are never going to be entirely accurate. Once electricity is generated, it travels round the country via high voltage, long distance wires and cables. These wires and cables together form the transmission network, and it might be helpful to think of transmission lines as the motorways of the electricity system. So how does electricity reach your home? Well, via A roads and B roads, naturally. These A roads and B roads, the lower voltage wires and cables, form the distribution networks. Distribution networks are looked after by distribution network operators. They just ensure that electricity clears the final stage of the journey to reach you in your home. So, thanks for watching this series of the Energy Academy. I'll see you soon.